All right. Good morning, everyone. Good to see you. We're going to look at some verses today as it relates to the Sabbath and kind of get maybe a process of how it got to where it was. And one thing I found interesting is that I don't know if humans ever really caught on to what God wanted the Sabbath to be, what his purpose for it was. It's almost like they outthought the process and they just overcomplicated it. All right, so we're gonna begin in Exodus chapter 23, and then we're just gonna look at some places where we find the Sabbath, and then we're gonna end with some possible changes, not direct changes, but how they began to look at it and how God handled that, and what He did with that. All right, so Exodus chapter 23, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this before. I'm sure you've seen it, noticed it, but sometimes we forget stuff. That how long, at least how many chapters take up Mount Sinai and the giving of the law? And I ask that because for most people, it's like, well, the giving of the law is Exodus 20, and that's where it happens. Do you know how many chapters are taken up with the giving of the law? And in fact, that whole scene. And I don't exactly have the number after I asked the question, but it's quite a few that they are actually, and of course that encompasses the golden calf that is made, and there's just a lot of stuff that is given those 40 days that Moses is on the mountain. So that's kind of an either here nor there, but I think for most, I say most, it's Exodus 20, giving of the commands, and that's the law. But almost to the end of Exodus is just this huge amount of information. And maybe the other reason, I guess, why I find that interesting is, when Moses comes down and he breaks the tablets, 10 commandments comes down, and we're done. There's 10 commandments. But as he's up there for the 40 days, he's giving all of this information. And as Moses comes down, and that has been given. So the 10 commandments, yes, but the rest of the stuff that he gives just continues. So I found that interesting because I never thought about it in those terms. Okay, so Exodus 23, verses 10 and 11. We find not only the Sabbath. Am I really loud or am I good? Yeah, I feel like I'm reverberating in my own head. So in Exodus chapter 23, God also gives not only Sabbath in terms of 6 days and he rests on the seventh, but there's also work the land. You work the land for 6 years, and the seventh day you give it rest. You do not work it on that seventh year. And not only that, but for the foreigners, for the slaves, for other people, whatever the land grows on its own, just let them have it. So the land isn't working, but whatever comes out of it, you are to then give to foreigners, slaves, some of the poor, those kind of things. And I found that so interesting that God places that there, that the land isn't just going to sit, but whatever is there that's available for people, allow people to walk on the land, allow people to take this stuff, and just don't work the land, let it sit for that seventh year. Is there anything interesting about that you guys find, that when we look at what God does there, 6 days and then he rests, but then he does that for the land. Work it 6 years, and then on the 7th year, let it sit. Don't plow it, don't do anything to it. And that same method, that same pattern of 6 and 7 in terms of years for the land. Yeah.
I was thinking, it's pretty interesting. You let it lie, but you don't just forget it. People are still doing
Yes.
things. There's still service going on.
Yes.
And that's like Sabbath, we don't work, we still serve.
Yes.
There's service still allowed.
Yes.
And so that's that the land doesn't become desolate, because if you were just to ignore it totally, it would, but it needs to be, so people come and they serve themselves, those that need assistance, or the landowner will take things and give.
Yes.
Whatever
Yes.
type of thing. And I think that's really a beautiful
Yeah.
way for us on the Sabbath. We're not supposed to just lay around and sleep.
Right,
Which
right.
sometimes
Right.
it's necessary, but we do other things too.
Right. Right.
I like that.
Yeah,
I like
yeah,
that
for
right
sure.
here.
For sure. And then Exodus 23, verses 12 and 13. 6 days you are to work, but on the 7th day do not work. And again, this is one of those things that I just find interesting as God outlines this. Verse 12, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. And so it's not just a day of rest for Israel, although this pattern is given to Israel, but if those things working for you, they need to rest too. They need to stop and be given some time. So it's not just Israel; it's also those things working: the ox, the donkey, the animals, also the slaves in your home, in your household, the foreigner living among you, that they may be refreshed. And so even within what we find in Genesis 2 about the Sabbath and what it's there for, as well as the pattern that God gives us, but what is something else that the Sabbath is supposed to do? It's for refreshing. It's so that we stop and we refresh ourselves, as opposed to continuing to push on. God has a day for us to stop and be refreshed. What's that?
Except for preachers.
Right? Well, at least we enjoy what we do. That's most of the time anyway.
Your Sabbath is on
That's right. That's right. God allows for that, right? So Exodus 31 is the next time we see this idea of the Sabbath. Exodus 31, verse 13. And I tried to find the best ways to kind of lay these out. I don't know how your visual is, but this is kind of how I was going to actually do this and separate them, but then you have two frames, and whatever level of OCD I have, that bothers me. Anyway, I was trying to explain to you why I did 13, 14, and 15 this way. Exodus 31 in verse 13. Goodness. Okay, let's start in verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbath. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. So, first of all, that the Sabbath is a sign between Israel and the Lord. And for whatever conversations may go on, and there may be stuff here that I'm missing, and I'm very open to that. But it's important for us to understand the idea of the Sabbath is good. But to lay that on anybody outside of the Jews at this time, all of this is written to the Jews, to Israel. Say to the Israelites from Moses, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign, a contract between me and you for generations to come, so that you will know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. So whenever they remember the Sabbath and they do the Sabbath, they remember the contract that they have with God that they agreed to. They would be his people. They would follow his ways. They would honor his holiness. They would trust him, etc., etc. So again, the Sabbath is more than just a day to stop, a day to heal, a day to refresh. God here calls it a sign. It's a reminder of the contract that they made. And it's not just for them, it's for generations to come, to remember, to know, to be aware of that God is sovereign. God is Lord. And it's not just that I am the Lord, it's I am sovereign. I take care of you. I provide for you. And I have made you holy. I have separated you. Yeah.
I think it's interesting. It's clearly a sign, in one sense, for the Israelites to remember the covenant. But I think it's also for God to remember the covenant. We see many times where God says, "I will remember my covenant. I will remember. I will remember." Now, does God need to remember? He's God. But at the same time, He says that, right?
Yeah.
So it is this idea that I think when He saw Israel observing the Sabbath, honoring the Sabbath, keeping it holy.
Right.
When he saw that,
Yeah.
then he remembered his covenant with Israel, and honored his covenant with Israel.
Yeah.
So I think it kind of does go both ways.
Yeah.
It's a two-way street. God needed to see that Israel was respectful and honoring and keeping the Sabbath holy.
Yes. And on a very much aside, and not only do we not have time, but something I have found interesting in some of the podcasts I listen to is to try and define and make clear what your concept of God is. Because for many years, God doesn't need to remember. God doesn't need to rest. And I found all these assumptions and premises that I was making in my head about my concept of God. And when I would come to verses like, with Noah, God remembered Noah and the covenant he made. Well, why would God need to remember? Because he's God and sovereign and all of those kind of ideas. So I'm kind of in the middle of that process of possibly reconstructing how I see this, not the concept of God, that God is a concept, because God is real, but how I see him. Because he does say he remembered Noah, he remembered Abraham, he remembered covenants. And as I was listening to this podcast, the word remember really isn't our remember. It is a different type of word in the Hebrew that God is aware of. God is constantly processing. He's recalling. Yes. Well,
He's bringing it to his
mind. And so whenever they follow the Sabbath and they follow the laws that God gave and they respected and had reverence for what he did, he recalled that and it maintained their relationship, et cetera, et cetera. So I would encourage you to, Bob.
It's also interesting to me, I'm not the oldest guy here, but when I was a kid, nothing went on Sundays.
Yeah.
The stores were closed, the shops were closed. I don't know if restaurants were popular back then, but and slowly, things have crept in, and now it's Sunday is hardly noticeable from another day.
Yeah.
When you're out in the world.
Yeah.
Which is I find it interesting at least.
Well, so on that note, number two, an aside, is if you were to look, this is something that deeply fascinates me as it relates to the church. If you go from the 50s till now and you look at the changes in our culture and how that has affected the church, and when I say church, I don't mean on Sunday, I mean how it affects how we view our lives and our patterns and all that kind of thing. I mean, it is true. We had a lot more time to rest and stop. And now, man, you can go 7 days a week and just push through so many things and never stop. I mean, even anytime I sit down, and I don't know how you guys are, I would imagine maybe not y'all so much in terms of just because of how you grew up. But man, if I sit down and I'm waiting for the doctor for Austin, or I don't know, anywhere, I mean, I'm entertaining myself somehow with Facebook, or I go on ESPN. I mean, I'm on this often because I've got about 5 apps that I'm on a lot. And you can say what you want to about the addiction and all those kind of things, but to rest our mind, to rest our bodies, to rest our thinking can be a challenge because of how much our culture has changed in the last 70 years. Okay, so the Sabbath is a sign. The Sabbath is a holy day for Israel. And I emphasize that in 2 ways. Number one, the Sabbath day was specifically, really only for Israel, unless you proselyted or you were a foreigner who worked for an Israelite, it seems to say. But outside of that, Sabbath wasn't for Gentiles. Never has been. It was something that God gave to Israel to follow, to work with, etc. And I say that because I was looking at some websites and over the years reading some stuff where you have churches who are pretty strong that we still need to be observing the Sabbath because it's biblical, it's in the 10 Commandments, etc. But 2 points about that. Number one, as you read through the Moses on Sinai, if you start in chapter 20 and you just keep reading, every time you look, the Sabbath is for Israel. It's not for the Gentiles. It's much like if we were to go over now to Germany or any other country. I go over there and they're not following the Constitution of the United States or the Bill of Rights because that's not their stuff. That's a different country. And nowhere does God call Gentiles to follow the Sabbath. It's just not there. And then whenever you get into the New Testament and the beginning of the church, it's not there. Now, it's being pushed by the Jews who then convert to Christianity, and there's a whole other study there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the whole reason why you have the Sabbath law and all the other laws that were given is because Israel was chosen.
Yes,
and I think that gets lost sometimes, and maybe we don't fully appreciate just what that looks like. It's not like that God hated the Gentiles.
Right.
That wasn't the
Right.
It's just that He chose Israel. And we know, of course, that salvation comes from the Jews.
Yes,
Through the Jews,
yes.
because Christ came through the Jews, and so
Yes.
that we know that that's why all that happened.
Yeah.
But again, they were a chosen people.
Yeah.
God chose them.
Yeah.
And I think they rightly needed to choose God. That was the whole covenant thing.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes.
It reminds me of that Fiddler on the Roof with Ted Yates says, I know that we are your chosen people, but just once, I wish you would choose someone else. But, and I think the Jews struggle with that, that mindset is, that this concept that I have been chosen, we have been chosen,
Right.
Comes with certain obligations that the Gentiles did not have.
Right. Yeah.
But for a good purpose, too.
Yeah.
And so it's,
Yeah.
maybe, I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Well, but part of what I was trying to get across a couple of weeks ago is whenever you look at, you go from Genesis with Adam and Eve, and then you fast forward to the flood, and you look at all the decisions made up to that point, and even when you get to the flood, all the decisions of man are evil all the time. And then you get to Noah, and then you jump forward to Abraham. And both in Genesis as well as in Romans, God continued to say Abraham was righteous because he believed. He believed in whatever way he could, this vision that God had for redeeming mankind. And so God chose Abraham to be a blessing and to bless how many people? All nations, all times, to be a blessing for them. And then as you have the foresight of all the way to Revelation, we find that blessing all people is through Jesus and through the resurrection. But it all started with Abraham and his people. And so God not only chooses a people, but he's going to give them a land, Canaan. He's going to give them a law, which is the Torah, essentially. And he's going to give them other things as well, to define them as a new people. In fact, I'm not thinking of exactly where it is. It's in Exodus 12, I want to say, wherever the Passover starts. And he tells them, this will begin a new year for you. You're going to start over as a nation. Land, law, people, leader, all of it. Sin, all of it. And part of that, and I guess part of what I'm trying to communicate is part of that, this law, is the Sabbath. You can do it. I mean, anybody could do it. But for the Jews, it was a part of this covenant, a part of this agreement that they made with God. And to that point, chapter 31, it is a sign, a covenant. It is a day for you to remember me and me to remember you. In verse 15, God made Israel holy, or separated them from all people. So Israel is called to make the Sabbath holy, to separate it. Yeah, Bob.
And of course, going into this, there were lots of nomadic tribes wandering around. They were not identified in any particular way. Really what brought this together was they were slaves together in Egypt.
Yeah.
And where all the slaves came from, they probably came from a lot of different places.
Oh, yeah.
But as they left Egypt, God identified them as his people.
Right.
And that's really where they were, as you say, made holy, set apart.
Yeah.
And this was, what, over 1,000 years before there was any thought of the Gentiles joining.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Holy cow, yeah. Yeah. And you know, I think that's a point that really needs to be not ratified, but really made more clear, because we throw around this word holy a lot, what it is, what it means. And as you go through Exodus, in the times that it's used here, when you look at Leviticus, God's saying, I made you holy. You're holy because of me. And when we think of holy, there's this reverence, well, I don't know what you think. There's all kinds of things people think when they hear holy. But at its base, holy set apart, as unique, as different, whatever the case may be. And we can have holy things in a more secular sense, where we set people or things apart as unique, as something special, whatever it may be. And so when God made Israel holy, it's not in terms necessarily of forgiveness. He made them holy through Abraham as, well, what was the specific reason? Well, you ask an open-ended question and you might get 4 answers that aren't in your head. He made them holy for the purpose of Jesus, to bring about the seed of Christ, to bring about the resurrection, to bring about the church. And it all started generally with Abraham.
And to stop them from, although unsuccessfully at first, to stop them from pagan worship.
Yes, very true. Very
I
true.
am the only God.
Yes.
You can worship me.
Yes. And you know, again, to that point, podcast, as I'm listening to it, one of the reasons to separate them was for that purpose. They're going to be going through a lot of nomads, a lot of different tribes, and monotheism at this time wasn't just unheard of. I mean, everybody had multiple gods. Everybody was polytheistic. So all of a sudden, Israel shows up and God says, I'm it. I don't want 2, I don't want 4. In fact, when you go through the 10 Commandments, I don't know why I'm laughing. I guess as we understand the culture and setting of the time, God, throughout the Bible tells us he's a jealous God. He's a God that wants us to follow him. So, Exodus 20, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. out of the land of slavery. Have you ever noticed that? When you look at the Ten Commandments and other places in the Old Testament, as God refers to his people, what is one of the things he always brings up as to why he is their God and why they should follow him?
I've chosen you.
I've chosen you. I brought you out of Egypt. You were there for 430 years, multiple generations. I went in, swooped you out. And in fact, not only swooped you out, but as you left, you got a bunch of stuff. A bunch of stuff. And in fact, it could be argued. I hope this is encouraging to you, because we're kind of shotgunning this, but it could be argued that what they had for the golden calf, when Aaron went to people and said, hey, give me all your stuff. Well, where do you think they got their stuff? From Egypt. All that stuff God blessed them with to be able to use along the way, they threw it into this cauldron and create this calf. So it's possible one of the reasons, obviously, that God was mad with them was that they made this idol, but also it's what they made it out of. I gave that to you. How many times maybe you give your kids some money for a specific purpose, and they ended up spending it on candy or something dumb, and you're like, oh, that $20 is for whatever. What God gave them was for their journey, and they ended up using it on an idol. And they ended up eating it. That's right. That's right. So the second thing is, you shall have no other gods before me. I am it. Singular. Monotheistic. The third one, you shall not make for yourselves any image in the form of anything in heaven above, earth beneath, or in the waters below. Don't bow down to them. Don't worship them. I am sovereign alone. And if you're reading there with me, verse, I don't have my glasses on. Verse 5, I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God. I've picked you. I've chosen you. I have a purpose for you. I don't want you going around checking out other nations, other gods. I don't want you doing that. You are my people. Yeah.
It's also interesting too. Imagine what it would have been like had God not done it. Had God not handed down the Ten Commandments and the whole law.
Yeah.
If that had never happened, how much time would it have taken before you're at another point where you have another flood, another Noah?
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because without this, there's no stabilizing force.
Right.
And in fact, you see the Jews becoming that in the world of their time.
Yes.
And then through Christ and churches today, look at it just from a practical sense.
Yeah.
How the church has, in a sense, stabilized, nations.
Yeah,
At least
yeah.
given them a model of
Right.
how to live.
However
their lives.
fluid, yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
It's interesting that all this came through this law
Yes.
that was given to the Jews.
Yes.
That they, of course,
Yes.
couldn't keep, but
Yes.
could.
And even to that point, whenever you consider, I don't know, in any day, just as you're driving around, there are so many laws and things in place that we don't even think about. It's just so automatic because we grew up in this culture. I was driving around yesterday, and I don't know, I came to a stoplight, and green and yellow and then red, and I stop, and for whatever reason, it was just like, me and the other side, we stop, and then this side goes, and then they stop, and we go, and that's been happening for decades. I don't even think about the fact that it's structure. People obey and they follow these laws. Generally. Generally. And we have structure. We have stabilization generally within our culture. And so whenever God lays these down, and maybe you read through Exodus and Leviticus and you're like, holy cow, God told them what to do in every possible situation. Well, we really have that today. We just don't think about it because we do it every day. It's just something that we've grown up in, and it's a process that we don't think about very much. So I wanted to go back through Exodus 20 there to remind us, and then verse 7, You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord your God will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. And I think we talked about this last week, is the first three are, I just always thought you have 4 are God and 6 are man. But the first 3 are God. I'm God, end of story. What is the 4th? Keep the Sabbath day holy. I gave it to Adam and Eve. Well, I didn't actually give it to Adam and Eve. I said it as holy then, and now I want you to remember it. Keep it holy. Keep it separate. Make it something very unique for you. And then he goes into a lot of, have you ever noticed the detail that God goes into with the Sabbath in Exodus 20? The 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you do not work, neither you, your son, your daughter, your male or female servant, your animals, your foreigner residing in your towns. God worked 6 days, rested on the 7th, and that's what I want you to do. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he made it holy. And then he gets into the rest of this is about how they should treat their fellow man. So we find honoring God, honoring what he did, honoring each other, honoring mankind, your fellow man.
There's any doubt about how serious God viewed keeping the Sabbath holy. What's the consequence?
Death.
Death.
If you don't keep it,
Yes.
you should be put to death.
Yes.
I guess
Yes.
pretty serious.
Yes. And in fact, the more things that I read, I was like, holy cow. I mean, this isn't just one of those, I would like for you to keep it holy. I would like for you to honor it. It'd be good for you if you honor it. It's helpful for your, your well-being and all that kind of stuff. If you don't keep it, you're going outside of town, and people are going to take you out. Wow. I've as I haven't studied Sabbath a long time, I've forgotten how very, very specific God was about all of these things. So quickly, and our bell may go off here in a few minutes. Exodus 34:21, even in plowing and harvest time. So if you are plowing your field, you're right in the middle of work. 34:21. 6 days you shall labor, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Even during plowing season and harvest, you must rest. So I don't care what's happening to the field. I don't care what's going on, what you have planned. When the Sabbath starts, which remember we talked about a couple weeks ago, their Sabbath started when? Friday night. So that night, when evening hits, you're done. You put everything up, you stop. I don't care what you're doing, you stop working. You stop and you remember God's provisions, God's promises, you remember God's protection. You take that time to remember that even the plowing you're doing, even the work you're doing, God gave you the soil, God gave you the seed, God gave you the production, the harvest. All of it is from God. You need to stop and remember that. Now, maybe to close today, why was it so important that they needed to stop and remember all of those things? Why would that be so important? Not for God, for them, but for them from God. You remember, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So why would that be so important for them? And yes, I have a specific answer in my head.
Because, all the blessings that men receive come from the hand of God.
Yes.
And you need to have a sense of gratitude and a sense of thanksgiving.
Yeah. And I really think that's it. God knows man. God knows man is deceitful. God knows man is so encumbered by sin and by Satan that God says, if you don't stop and look back at what all the things that I've done, even all the way back to Egypt, remember what I've done for you, then you're going to forget. And you're going to start thinking, my work produced all of this. My labor produced, my genius made this stuff happen. And you're going to forget that the ground and the seed and the production and the harvest, all of it, God has done. Everything God has done. And in fact, whatever gifts and talents you have, God gave you all that stuff. So take a day, take the time to stop and remind yourself so you don't get haughty, you don't get overzealous about what you've done. You have to stop. And why does God say even if there's harvest, if you're plowing, just give it a day? But God, what about? Who's going to take care of whatever happens? God's going to take care of it. God's given it to you. He's going to bless you. He's going to take care of it. You need to stop. And to Doug's point, this wasn't just a suggestion from God. It wasn't a this would be good for you from God. This is a you do it or you die. It is that important because if you don't do this and you do forget, then you're going to die anyway because ultimately generations are going to be taken away.
Well, and to that point, it's interesting. This comes kind of at the end of the giving of the law. This is really kind of the last piece before we get to chapter 13.
Yes.
And it says it right there in verse 13, where he says, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
here's all the law, and above all that,
Yes.
keep my
Yes.
Sabbaths.
Yes. Yes.
This is the most important, which is interesting. I think that's, the first and greatest command is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself, right?
Yeah.
And the Sabbath, I think, aids you in doing that.
Yes. Yes.
That
Yes.
is critical, in fact, is
Yes.
what God is saying is this is critical for you, loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor.
Yes. And that is really the point of all we're trying to do here in these whatever weeks we're going to spend on the Sabbath. The Sabbath isn't just about stopping. And in fact, the Sabbath really isn't about stopping. The Sabbath is about us going into this place where we get reminded that God is good and God's our protector and God has promises and God has provision and everything in front of me is because God blessed me with it. So when I move on in the future, every seventh day, I've got to stop and remind myself who I am. I'm just human, and I'm fallible, and I'm deceitful. But who is God? Exodus chapter 20. God is monotheistic. God is all-powerful. God took us out of Egypt. God is great. God is provider. All those kind of things. So it's seriously not about stopping. It's about remembering what God has done for them and how much God has blessed him. Ken?
I grew up on a farm, so I can relate to this plowing and harvesting thing.
Yeah.
You have a very limited window when your fields need to be prepared and when you need to get your crop planted.
Yeah.
Because if it's not timely, it really adversely affects the yield.
Yeah.
If you don't get that crop in on time. But at the same time, where we came from, we had thunderstorms almost every day down there, and you could lose your entire wheat crop in an hour
Right.
if you were hit with one of those hailstorms.
Yeah.
So harvest time was really a hectic time.
Yeah. Yeah.
We started combines when the grain got dry enough in the morning, generally about 9 o'clock, and we ran till 2 in the morning until I got too tough to thrash.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Which really kind of enhances this idea from God. I don't know farming. I just know what it says. But you talk to a farmer and he's like, man, that's a busy time. And for God to say you need to stop for a day. And you have some of these men that may be a little bit more strong-willed. They're like, look, I get your point. I remember you. Great. I got to harvest. That's a lot of work. So I ain't stopping. And so it was a very, very important time for them. So we'll continue on this next Sunday, Lord willing. Let's close with a prayer. God, we ask that you help us to not only know your laws, but know the reason behind them, to have reverence for them, so that we can keep you in our minds as Lord, as sovereign, as the great I am. Father, help us to do this. In the great name of Jesus we pray. Amen.